Sexual reproduction in flowering plants, Part 3. After this section, you should be able to outline the process of pollination, including on how to describe self and cross-pollination, how to describe insect-pollinated and wind-pollinated flowers. What is the purpose of pollination? In order for fertilizations to occur, the male and the female gametes need to come into contact. In flowers, the transfer of the pollen grains, which consists of the male gametes, from the anther to the stigma is called pollination. The agents that brings about this transfer is what we call a vector. It can be insects, it can be wind. When the insects enters the flowers, pollen grains from the anthers stick onto the insect. If the pollen grains from a previous visitor flowers are present on the insect, it will then be transferred to the sticky stigma. However, for wind-pollinated flowers, they have their pollens carried away by the wind when the exposed anther shake in the wind. Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. Pollination is important to help bring together the male and the female gametes to enable fertilizations to take place. There are two types of pollinations: self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination is the transfer of the pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flowers or a different flowers but on the same plant. Examples we can look into this diagram. These are two different flowers but on the same plant. The anther from flowers A is transferred to the stigma of flower B. It can also happen when the anther of flower A is transferred to the stigma of flower A itself. Self-pollination occurs in flowers. They are bisexual with anthers and stigma maturing at the same times, meaning that these flowers, they have both the male and the female's reproductive system in the same plant. In this flower, the stigma is situated directly below the anther. What are some advantages of self-pollination? They only require one parent. Some of the beneficial qualities are passed down from the parent plant to the offspring. They do not require external factors for pollinations. Also, less pollen and energy is waste. And most likely, fertilizations can take place because the stigmas are closer to the anthers. However, this type of pollinations also brought about some of the disadvantages. Offspring produced are genetically similar to the flowers, causing fewer varieties and the possibility of bringing the harmful recessive genes expressed in the offspring. Cross-pollination is the transfer of the pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of a flower of another plant belonging to the same species. Let's look at the diagram here. These two flowers come from different plants but the same species. The anther of flower A from plant A can be transferred to the stigma of plant B. Cross-pollination occurs in plants that bears only the male or the female flowers. They also happens only in the plants with bisexual flowers, but the anthers and the stigmas matured at different times. And the stigmas of the plants are situated at a distance away from the anthers. What are some of the advantages of cross-pollinations? The offspring can inherit the beneficial qualities from both the parents and hence produce more varieties of the offspring. The seed produced are capable of surviving longer before germinations, and the possibility of these harmful genes being expressed in the cross-pollination flower is lower. However, cross-pollinations require two different plants of the same species, and it will depend a lot on the external factors. For example, the external agents of pollinations like winds and insects are required. Cross-pollination is less likely to occur as compared to self-pollinations, since they require two parent plants and hence more energies and the pollens are wasted. Let's look at some of the examples of self-pollinations. Examples like the papaya plants. The papaya plants for the male, they only produce the male flowers, and the female trees only produce the female flowers. So in this case, it's impossible for self-pollinations to happen. For this system, some of the drawbacks like only the female trees are able to produce the fruits, and in the areas where there are few papaya trees, the pollen has to travel a long distance. Cross-pollinations requires the external factors, for example, insects and winds, to help in pollinations. Let's look at the insect-pollinated flowers. It depends mainly on the insect for transfer of the pollens to the stigma. So some of the modifications that's done on the flowers to make them attractive to the insect, for example, large brightly colored petals, contents of the nectar. Some of the internal structures like the insect will brush against them while collecting the nectar. Let's look at our typical insect pollinated flowers. The external structures, for example, the petals, sepals, receptacles, and stalk. The male structures containing the anthers, the filaments, and the female structures, the stigma for pollinations, style to support the stigma. Ovaries contains the ovules. Inside the ovules, there is where the female gametes is. Some of the characteristics of the insect-pollinated flowers including bright colored petals, large petals produce the scents to attract the insect from a distance, nectar and nectar guides to help to lead the insects to the flower. If we look at the previous diagram, we can see that the stigma lies within the flowers, and the anther also lies inside the flowers, so that the pollinating agents like insects can brush against it when it collects the nectar. The filaments in the insect-pollinated flowers, they are strong to support the insect when they collect the pollens for food or when brushed against the anthers. Pollen grains in the insect-pollinated flowers are larger and they have sticky surface to help them to stick to the insect. They produce less amount of pollens, and mostly these are the bisexual flowers. Some of the differences between the insect-pollinated and the wind-pollinated flowers. If we look at the diagram here, insect-pollinated flowers tend to have large brightly colored petals, but wind-pollinated flowers, they are small, dull, and the flowers are protected by the modified leaves. Insect-pollinated flowers produce a strong smell, while wind-pollinated flowers are usually scentless. Insect-pollinated flowers has the nectar and the nectar guide. The stamen is not pendulous and do not protrude out of the flowers. If you look at the diagram here, the anther and the filaments is inside the flower. Stigma are small and compact and also do not protrude out of the flowers. And for insect-pollinated flowers, they produce less amount of the pollen grains, but sticky so that the insect can stick on it. Wind-pollinated flowers, on the other hand, are pendulous and they protrude out of the flowers. The stigmas are large and feathery and also protrude out of the flower. They produce more pollen grains, which are small and light in number. In the next sections, we will look into fertilizations of the flowering plants, including the growth of the pollen tube and the entry into the ovule.